Welcome everyone. I think we'll get started here on the Q&A session for Take Your .NET Apps to the Cloud with Microsoft Azure. So just a few quick, de rigueur housekeeping items. The way to engage, because we've got folks both physically here in person, as well as on the Teams chat. For folks who are here, just raise your hands. And then again, if you're joining us hybrid via Teams, just pop a question here into the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on both. Beyond that, just as usual, right, this may all be recorded, so let's be on best behavior, code of conduct. You've probably seen this 23 times before, so thank you, everyone. And moving right along, let's talk about who's actually here. So I'm going to actually start with Tulika, if you give a quick intro.
Hi, I'm Tulika. I'm a product manager with Azure App Service, Linux side of it. So if you've got your .NET app and you want to bring it on Linux, please come and talk to me.
Taylor Brown, I'm the group product manager for Windows containers, and specifically focus around Windows containers on AKS.
And lastly, I'm Stefan Schackow. I'm the product manager lead for Azure App Service for both Windows and Linux. So hopefully can answer a lot of questions here that folks have. So just to sort of set the context, right, when we're talking about being able to run .NET workloads in Azure today, this isn't the comprehensive list, but it's sort of the list of things that would involve folks running .NET on one kind or another of a managed service. Right, there's App Service, which is about hosting web apps and API apps, and we actually started many years ago, being able to bring .NET apps up into Azure, specifically .NET Classic, running as source code on Windows. And these days, we've sort of matured and branched out. So you can run them in Windows containers on the Windows side. You can run .NET Core on Windows, and you can also run .NET Core source code or containerized on Linux. And Taylor, do you want to talk to AKS?
Yeah, sure. So AKS is our Kubernetes service. So this allows us to run containerized applications, Linux or Windows, kind of a common control plane. The Windows containers obviously run on Windows worker nodes. The Linux containers run on Linux worker nodes. We're finding that customers really like to have that kind of common control plane, that seamless way to manage both. And we fully support .NET, of course, both .NET Core as well as older versions of .NET, back down to 2.0.
All right, cool. And then a couple of other options, which are sort of newer additions, though they have been here each for a few years. Static web apps supports running more, single page style applications. You see there on the slide Blazor WebAssemblies for what you deploy and run up in the browser. And then also it has great backend support to .NET backends, which realistically can run pretty much anywhere. And then lastly, in the offerings of managed services, there's Azure Functions, which again, probably many of you folks have used for quite a while, right? That's had great .NET support from day zero and supports serverless style functions apps running again both on Windows as well as on Linux. So that's sort of just the quick intro on slides. Again, this is meant to be ultimately a Q&A session about, folks' curiosity questions. It can be technical things you may be running into. It can be strategy questions in terms of how you're thinking about bringing .NET workloads up into Azure. But ultimately, with the folks we have here, right, we've all got pretty deep experience running workloads across Windows and Linux. So happy to hear either, again, online or in person, any kind of questions folks might have.
That strategy is the main thing. So that's what we're struggling with right now. We have legacy application in .NET 3.5 as well as .NET Core application also, which is in multi-layer UI, API, and database. So what would be the good strategies to do?
Okay, so just also for folks on Teams, just sort of replaying and re-summarizing it, which is a question in the room. There's the canonical thing. You have a lot of .NET estate stretching all the way back to .NET 3.5, up to newer and more recent .NET Core apps. Sort of what are strategies and what are approaches for it. So again, because of course I'm going to be a little bit biased, I will go last. Look to you first, Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, I think we get a lot of questions about which service should I use for a given thing in Azure, and the reality is that there are many services for most workloads, and a lot of it depends on what your ultimate goals are, what the scale factors are, how the application's architected, the team, the familiarity with some of the services that will help kind of dictate the best answer for it. I've seen customers in the same kind of approach be very successful with Kubernetes. I was talking to earlier about one of our teams in Azure Storage, actually two teams. One took their existing app, containerized it with Windows containers, moved it into AKS, and then they've slowly been refactoring it to .NET Core and Linux, and they can kind of do that one piece at a time. But they get the CI/CD practice, they get the ability to do redeploys. When things don't work, they can back it off and kind of move that direction. The other team took a ground-up rewrite approach and moved everything to .NET Core. They ultimately ended up having to scale that back and move over back to their older Windows app because they couldn't get the same functionality in the same time frame. At the same time, I've seen customers who started all over from scratch and were up and running fairly quickly with .NET portability and just the ability to kind of refactor. In a similar vein, I think you'll probably talk about the app service side, but we've seen customers be incredibly successful with app service. We've seen people who really preferred containerization, and we've seen people who frankly just preferred VM scale sets. That was the easiest approach for their workload. So I can't give you a single answer that says this is the magic solution for you. It really does depend a bit on your ultimate goals, how you're planning to scale, what your path to modernization looks like, skill sets of the teams. A lot of those kind of factors come into play.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things to echo it, and again, bouncing around a bit. There's always an approach of looking at things from a service viewpoint, right? And you can sort of enumerate all of the Azure services and say, here, go use X, and then go use Y, and then go use Z. Maybe things that are a little bit more of a holistic way of approaching it, which is sort of for the developers and the teams who are going to be bringing these apps up into Azure and are probably going to be maintaining it over the long haul. Sort of what's their focus, skill set, interest area, things like that. That's one thing to consider. Another one is whether or not, an organization, does the organization have a sort of an already fixed strategy for where they want to run things or not. The reason why I bring that up, again, perfect example with Kubernetes, is, right, the org may have already made a pretty deep investment on it from the point of view of operations and a common control plane. Classic example, I was joking earlier, right, if I go down the street to a Fred Meyer's, right, like Azure is not running in the checkout lane. I don't actually know what's running in the checkout line, but there's probably a pretty good bet there might be some kind of a variant of a K8 or K3 setup running there. And so that's an example where an org may be like, look, because of that sort of on-prem aspect, they may want to standardize on Kubernetes as a control plane. So it's a perfect example where the work Taylor's team does on Windows containers is great because it means your developers can focus on, case in point, they could go put a classic 3.5 ASP.NET app into a Windows container and go deploy it on an AKS cluster. And the ops team is happy because, like, great, I see a common control plane and I don't have to, suddenly sort of change my paradigm. Now, by the same token, right, myself, my day-to-day job, I deal with lots of customers where they're coming from a world that's very familiar with their working in Visual Studio. They're accustomed to deploying to more of a traditional .NET IIS server setup. And if you think about it, app service, that is literally what we were underneath the hood, when we started 10 years ago. And the Windows side of the house is like a really super duper, insanely huge set of Windows IIS clusters running all over the world. And so if that's something that's familiar and natural, be like, okay, that's a very logical place to say, okay, instead of deploying to the cluster that's in my data center, I'm instead deploying to this thing running up in the cloud. And we do support all the way down to, again, .NET 3.5 and will basically for as long as that's supported. So that's also a very natural way of doing things. I'll also tell you straight up, there have been any number of customers where they started out migrating and they brought more of classic .NET up into the cloud onto app service, and then as time went on, they were like certain parts of their app portfolio they're factoring off, or they're developing greenfield because they're like, we're going to put this functionality to bed and bring up a like totally new implementation off to the side. And there they decided, okay, we're going full microservices, and that was the part of their .NET estate going forward that they chose to go implement over on a Kubernetes substrate. But again, it's ultimately for the developers who are going to be working day to day, the ops teams that are going to be working day to day, what are they leaning towards? What is their true hands-on familiarity with? That's certainly an important thing to keep in mind, right? So it depends, is the summary. And you're not going to go wrong wherever you end up landing in Azure. We'll make sure that those workloads are taken care of. So I see something on the chat.
We've got a couple chat questions that came in that are pretty great. Nick asked, hello, when you run a workload on Azure App Service, Application Insight App Map can track the connection between the application and the compute. Pretty handy capability. This is not the case for AKS. In the case of App Insights, acknowledges the application, but not it running on AKS. Are there changes, improvements planned here? So yes, we are doing a bunch of work on the observability front for App Insights with AKS. For example, we've got a good case study that's published. All of the M365 infrastructure, Teams, Skype, SharePoint, all of these are moving to Windows containers on AKS. And a bunch of this observability challenges have come forward as we're starting to scale those over a million plus cores. And so we've got a pretty deep investment going into that observability front and some of those kind of enhancements. I don't have specific timelines on and features, but there are some pretty significant investments coming there in the next couple of semesters. And then we got one other one here. What support is .NET going to offer for WASI? At Build 2022, this was presented as an experimental project. Are there plans to make this production ready with support to run .NET apps compiled to WASM on Azure via WASM runtime and orchestration?
I know vaguely what those acronyms mean. I admit I am the wrong person to be answering that question. We do have .NET folks here, though, at Build.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know the official answer to it. I've been part of some of the work that's gone on to do some prototypes, but I don't have an official position on when it's going to be or if it's going to be production. But we can try to track some folks down and see if we can get a reply back for you.
Yeah. All right. So let's take a quick look. And again, if folks have questions on, again, .NET or again, any of the services we're talking about.
In the back here.
By all means. Okay, go. Okay, so the question is, you wrote a lot of Azure functions and then they grew wildly out of control. Can we give you any hints for wrangling those back under control? So the first thing that comes to mind is more generally for anything where you have a lot of things that popped up in Azure and grew out of control, which I'll go out on a limb and say it's probably not only functions for folks over time. It definitely things like Azure Resource Graph, where you can go out and just query and say, can you find me stuff that's running out there in a given subscription in resource groups for different types, just to see like what the heck all is out there. Now, from an architectural standpoint, right, when someone is running, for example, a bunch of functions, I guess one question I've got is, are they all just sort of doing like infra glue, or are they more doing a lot of API, like HTTP triggered style functions? Okay, so stuff, so sort of
a mix of everything, it sounds like.
Yeah, everything under the sun. The reason why I'm asking for that is at least for the HTTP triggers, which tend to feel a little bit more like, miniature APIs and a type of microservice, over time, if you can get those wrangled behind something like API management, and the reason why I mention that is, admittedly, whether it's functions or app service, and again, I defer to Taylor for AKS, but at least for the services I work with, there's not like a meta management plane that gives you a unified view of what the heck is out there, and can you give me more of a manageability view on it? Whereas with API management, you will get that, because then you could say, hey, the only way over time that those HTTP triggered functions get called is by way of API management sitting in front of it. Now you've got a management console, in quotes, that tells you this is what's here. You can actually throttle it, meter it, do additional kinds of tracking on it. You can actually migrate it over time. You can merge behind the scenes your implementations without your outside customers having any idea whatsoever that you made those changes. So certainly for that style of function, that's something I'd be like, use that. Well, for any of the functions, Azure Resource Graph or any Azure entity, to go just find what the heck all is out there and then see if at least the API-centric ones can migrate over time to sit behind API management.
Yeah, the other tip that I'll often reflect is kind of one of the things that we do internally. Nobody's getting to deploy something by themselves. No developer in our team is going to sit down and say, let me open the Azure portal and start deploying an app, right? They have to go through a CI/CD system. We create Terraform. We create automation that can repeatedly deploy that over and over again. There's ownership, all of those kind of tracking mechanisms. That obviously isn't going to help the history, but it might help the future and say, no, we're going to lock people out of subscriptions. You can have a test dev one. You can have a pre-production access that's maybe read-only or limited access. But when you get to production, no, that's going to get deployed by an automated system each time from a known build source. And then you can apply all the typical source control mechanisms, whether it's headers or whatever it happens to be that your organization uses. And at least then you've got some control over, I can redeploy this each time. There's an audit trail for it. I understand where it came from.
Okay, so we have some more questions on the chat. Let's see, we've got one here from Sachin. Do we have a standard guideline where developers can take decisions on app service versus AKS versus Azure functions based on load, performance, or usage?
We have struggled with this question for as long as I can remember working on Windows containers, which goes back quite a ways now, a lot of gray hairs from that. The challenge is it really depends on the workload, and it really depends on how that workload is going to be adapted. We have certainly seen workloads that lend themselves incredibly well to Windows containers and the ability to kind of shard them out, and we've seen ones that do not lend themselves particularly well to it, especially from like a performance and load generation standpoint. And every time we've tried to make a somewhat generic choose your adventure graph, quite quickly we find that it didn't work for a given scenario and a customer's frustrated. We told them go use app service for this, or we told them go use containers for that, and it was the wrong choice for their given workload because of some specific factor. And especially I think this is true when we're taking legacy apps forward, because these apps could be based on MSMQ and have started their life in Windows 2000 and have been updated and updated and updated since then. They could be fairly consistent with microservice patterns written in 2016, 2018. It just really depends on that application. So we don't really have a great hard guideline around it. More, I think, to the previous discussion, analyzing what your customer or what your team's used to working with, what your customer scenarios are, doing some POCs will typically lead you to an answer that's going to work best for your team.
And then also, I dropped it into the chat, also just mentioned it here. This is more a matter of anecdotally, and I know it's a bit off topic from the current services, but if you look in the Learn docs for a different service called Azure Container Apps, but if you look there, you'll see there's actually a page that specifically says, hey, can you explain to me what the heck all these different services are? And so it actually talks about AKS and app service and functions and container apps. If nothing else, it's a pretty straightforward way of giving a very pragmatic summary of what the heck the different services are really intended to solve. But echoing what we've said here, the reality is there is a heck of a lot of overlap in functionality in terms of what you can do with the different services. That's why exactly what I've been saying and Taylor's been saying, first see if you can find a simple reason for why you should go to one service or another. And again, I know it's a simpler view, but if someone's running Kubernetes for industrial factory automation, and so as a result, just for ease of consistency, they're like, please, let's run everything else in the same control plane. It's like, great, that's a perfectly reasonable decision to go make. But if you're going pure cloud native, usually for me, from a developer perspective, be like, can you look at serverless? Can you look at microservices? That's an architectural decision, not a service decision, right? And then from there, it's, for me, because I come from a service that's much more heavily abstracted, it's like, You might lean a bit more towards, again, something like functions or app service or container apps because they intentionally abstract away a lot of decisions so that you don't have to worry about things. However, that can be a double-edged sword, right? Maybe you're writing the IoT backends for, I don't know, internet-connected light bulbs, and you're literally going to have a million of these things as the years go by. And so now you're talking about a scaling problem where it's like, it might take you more work up front, but chatting earlier with Taylor, he's right. You should probably look at, wait a second, maybe that makes more sense to build out a Kubernetes topology, because although it's going to be more operational overhead, that thing you will have full control and you will be able to scale it and scale it and scale it any which way you want until the end of time. Okay, so it looks like we got more questions. Let's see.
Are there well-known strategies for migrating .NET monoliths to cloud-native apps? We'll try to grab a couple of resources, but Azure Migrate would be my first recommendation. We have in preview and soon to be GA support for AKS. We have support for app services in Azure Migrate. You can reach out and do discovery. We're making a fairly significant investment in this area because we continue to get customer inquiries about, hey, can you just give me the easy button and help me move these apps forward? And so you get to kind of choose the different services and it will give you recommendations and guidance. So that would be my first answer. There are also pretty good documentation resources. So I'll post in the Learn as well that has some great recommendations on, from a Windows container side at least, on these are the kinds of apps that work well. Here's the patterns. Here's the things that don't work well. If you've got a Win32 UI, calc.exe app, probably not a good answer. We try to guide some of those. If you've got Active Directory integration, what kind of work will work, won't work. So we can provide some guidance there. I think SIs can be pretty useful. We've got a lot of our customers who've worked with some of our great SI partners to help them kind of accelerate their journeys forward. And for a set of people, that's going to really make sense for you. So a couple different resources that we'll make sure and link in.
Yeah, and definitely to echo that, right? If you look in the Learn docs, and again, I dropped into the chat, which is sort of the top level link into Azure Migrate, sort of the product. That is both a product and sort of the collective wisdom and learning and tooling for being able to migrate on-prem workloads. And when I say on-prem, the reality is, you could migrate them from a VM. There's nothing purely on-prem about it, but it's there for .NET, it's there for Java, it supports source code and containerized options. It is literally the Swiss Army knife of pull the app from here and put it over there on a given service. Another thing that's very cool about it is that entire end-to-end flow gets continually invested in by any number of teams, including mine. And so, for example, a current focus, and again, it's not going to be a silver bullet, but a current focus is, say, can we do deeper code analysis and architectural analysis on the source applications to try to tell you, like, okay, these are problems you might run into, or these are things that you should be doing. Currently, right now, we tend to look at the source applications as a monolithic thing, like vacuum it up and go put it somewhere. And we're working on being able to go that one level deeper to say, hey, wait a second, we can actually see what you're calling out to, what kind of call patterns there are, what are things to be worrying about and thinking about. But also, I saw one of the replies there in the chat where, a gentleman saying he's, makes a living off of helping customers do this. You're right, there's also not going to be a press a button and it just poof. It's always going to show up in the cloud. Like, it needs folks like you to be there saying, like, okay, I have some idea of what the heck these apps have done in the past. I can make judgment calls about which ones to move and which ones not to move and which ones I'm going to modify.
Yeah, and I think the security element to those often comes into play. These auto magic solutions can kind of look good on paper, and they kind of feel good because you hit the button and the magic kind of happens. But if you don't have an understanding of where are the logs for that going? Where's what's the authentication model? Where is the data being stored? The wrong decisions can be easily made, and those can have some pretty catastrophic effects. So, even with our own tools like Azure Migrate, I strongly recommend making sure you have an understanding of what is the current operational model, security model, update model, and as we move it, what is that model going to look like? How am I going to update this app tomorrow? Do I have to reinstall it in a VM and re-migrate? That's probably not a particularly good answer. So doing a little bit of extra thinking beyond just the magic button moment.
Yeah, actually, from what Taylor is saying, it brings up one other very important point, which is, granted, we're talking here about moving the app to the cloud. Jokingly, right? Apps, you know what they're like? They're like old school televisions where you took off the back cover and there's like this explosion of spaghetti wires popping out of it, right? The app's connected to, is it calling 15 other apps? Is it talking to 14 on-prem databases? Is there someone that you've never heard of who had some very custom setup on-prem to actually call that specific app through some network path? Those are just real world challenges. Again, that's part of what we try to continually improve and invest in with the Azure Migrate toolset. Again, fully transparent. It's not going to find all of that, but that's where it's like, it's one thing to find the apps and give you some ideas on how to go move them, but ultimately knowing about a lot of those interdependencies, that's the part where, you know, in terms of guidance, again, probably not surprising, start out slow, take an app with a team that knows the app or has some familiarity with it, move it, monitor it, make sure you actually found those tendrils of app dependencies, and then rinse and repeat. And I see here, let's see in the chat from Jorg, question, is there something similar to Azure Spring Apps, but for .NET? I'm going to guess if we're talking about like Spring Apps, the service, the closest thing that comes to mind would be Azure Container Apps using .NET and another TLA using Dapper to be able to go build microservice style application that brings things like service discovery and ways of having pluggable interactions with things like a cache or a database or other services. And again, in the chat, it's there, and also for us in the room. If you just look in the Learn Docs, Azure Container Apps, there's actually a very extensive section about specifically the Dapper aspect of it. But that's what will come to mind for that.
Yeah, and then I think, you know, there's also some work that we've done around helping migrate Spring Apps to Azure. That was the other thing that came to mind, and that would be more the Azure Migrate experience, where we're looking out and kind of doing discovery and helping you migrate it.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, does Azure Migrate support migrating Spring workloads directly to Azure Spring Apps? I thought it was either there or they could at least like discover and assess it currently.
I'm pretty sure that they do support that all the way now. I'm not part of that team, but I'm pretty sure that is fully covered now. Yeah.
My customers running a .NET 4.8, ASP.NET backend, Angular frontend. If you look across the web tier and take any one server, IIS, running about 100 IIS apps. A lot of WCF services. Some of them are running in the same worker pool. The pattern that's very common is a service on the same box calls a service on the same box, right? So these are not microservices. They're just calling into each other. Some security mindset, however it is they got there. Finding a way to iterate to get them to cloud native. Azure App Service is kind of tough because we have 100 of these apps, or these 100 app service apps. Can they merge them? So one avenue is a Windows container, which we're almost calling like a mini VM, right? You take all those 100 IIS apps, run them in one container. Yes, you don't get the great scalability per service. Just Taylor, wondering your thoughts on that. And then I guess, Stefan, am I missing something with app service where I could host multiple IIS apps in one app service app, right? I don't want 100 app service apps. I want one app service app that's hosting a couple of them.
Yeah, just kind of repeating the part of the question for the stream anyway. Yeah, no worries. So it's a very common pattern, .NET 4.8, I believe you said, right? With WCF, each server has hundreds of instances in IIS, so every OS instance is hosting, many sub web apps that are calling into each other for some security or code portability reason. Who knows? The person who architected it's long gone. What are some patterns that could help move that app forward? App service seems a little challenging because it's hard to push all those in. Is a Windows container a better answer for it? What are some of the options around it? This is a pattern that we see a lot. Hundreds is less frequent, but tens are very frequent. And it was kind of the predecessor to the microservice model, this idea that, I'll put a bunch in and I can kind of scale this instance to the web app. And for a lot of reasons, it probably didn't really work out that way, but it is a pretty common model. And it's one that we've worked with a number of customers to help break apart over time. So they get the app in and it is 100 whatever instances in one container. It feels like a micro VM. But then you can start to cut off those services and start using service discovery to reroute them. And so now, maybe you pull out 5 services this year, 5 more services next year, And you can choose where to host those. You could choose to host them in their own container. You could rewrite them to .NET Core. You could put them behind an app gateway. You could put them in any number of services that make sense. Typically we're seeing people refactor them into either other Windows containers or into Linux containers. But it gives you a path forward with it for sure. And it does give you the horizontal scaling. So you're now not managing the VM. It's scaling itself out. We have one customer that we work with that literally just runs one pod per VM. It's one massive pod, but it's one pod per VM. We have an internal customer who does that as well. And so they've got like 1,000 nodes and one pod per Windows VM. Sure.
But what is the overhead now of that? They have to throw more cores at that VM than when they run their VMs?
Yeah, you're going to have a little bit more just because there's some there's, even if it's nothing else, there's some Linux overhead for the actual control plane and, the kubelet and all that. But the actual Windows container overhead in that instance is pretty small. You're not doing a bunch of file I/O, so you're not paying for I/O overhead. You're not really paying for too much network overhead at this point because we've done a lot of the work to make network pretty transparent. Now, if you were going to live that way forever, and never ever modernize anything, I'd probably be saying look at scale sets pretty heavily because it just doesn't feel like a pattern that's really buying you additional value. Now, if it's hey, we've bet on Kubernetes for everything and that's the way we're going to manage it, okay, maybe that kind of tips the tail, but or this is our pattern for today and we're going to, over the next 3 years, we're going to rewrite pieces of it, then it makes total sense. And that's the customer that, it's an internal customer. It used to be an external customer, not an internal customer. So you can take some guesses as to who that might be. But that's the pattern that they're on, and they're going to be rewriting that over the next, 5 years probably.
Well, look, I'll weigh in from an app service perspective and admit that you are right. We assume that there is a unique host name per app. And attempting to, let's say, 50 front ends and then 50 WCF services that are currently running as sub apps, I suspect are going to come to grief if we try to deploy them as a single app service app. As an aside, we do support the concept of marking a virtual directory as a quote unquote .NET app. But that's, it's there, it's used minimally, modestly, mainly for the vDIR support, not so much for the old school market as a sub app inside of IIS. With that said, you could, of course, like we were just talking about, you can stuff it into a Windows container. But what I'm thinking there is when we run Windows containers on app service, we look at it primarily as a way of solving compatibility issues, right? And so for folks who've run on app service, if you try to, for example, do like a PDF generator, font generator, it's a canonical example, it needs to call into Windows GDI, and by default on app service, we sort of block access to that for security reasons. So that's typically what we look at for Windows containers. When there's something of a native dependency, a Win32 API call that we'd normally block, say, okay, stick it in the container instead, and then you're off to the races. But in this case, I have to admit, I'd agree. I'd lean more towards AKS because beyond running all those apps sort of glommed together, then you got to operate it on day one, and someone wants to beam in there and say, what's going on amongst all those apps? And they're going to want to go futz around with, well, app number 38 burped and I need to go do something with it. And that's where it's like, yeah, with app service, we intentionally try to abstract things and we view the container more as a way of like, it's a different way to package and run an app, but we're really not looking to get into the business of, as you aptly called it, like running like a micro VM on a VM. Whereas that's a perfect example. AKS tends to come more from an infrastructure up perspective. And so if that's what you need, like, yeah, you can go beam into the container, SSH into it, right? And I admit, I don't know, can you RDP into a Windows container?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to assume you SSH into it and go party on it.
Or you just use kubectl and that allows you to route into it. Or really, we strongly advise more of the app insights model. Go snarf the logs go into a nice little pretty thing, right. Go write your queries against it, all of those kind of patterns.
Yeah. So look, this is something, it's come up before. I'm not going to say never, but I have to admit, like, given the fact that sort of architecturally the way we've structured apps on app services, an app is a thing with a routable URL. a certain inbound and outbound network behavior. And admittedly, we didn't build it from the perspective of, even though I know, like I probably did it myself 20 years ago, having, you know, a gazillion apps marked in there in IS manager as individual apps. We never really thought about running apps that way. So I don't know, we might change in the future. It's great to hear about it, but yeah, I agree with Taylor. It'd be like, yeah, I'd probably run the container as a just micro VM on a node.
Yeah, and you know, maybe this kind of gets back to the very first question of how do I decide these things, right? You know, you got to try a few different things, and yeah, if I've got developers who are in Visual Studio all day and it's a IIS front-end ASP.NET app, you know, app service is a super easy way for them to just hit the button. It moves from their desktop to the cloud. There's the whole CI/CD model gets built in. A lot of it gets handled for you. If that's the world you live in, that's probably an easier answer. If you've got a complex app that's doesn't really fit the model, you can either try to jam it in there, and you're probably going to feel some pain at some point, or you can try to find a different service that's going to work a little bit better for it. And that may have a different set of trade-offs around it.
Yeah, but also another thing, just sort of in closing on that, is think about it, like, because you brought up a good point, like, why wouldn't I run it on a VM? And this was something I brought up in a session I was in this morning. One of the things I'm always like worried about, and maybe it's a vibe just I get, is like if a workload lands on a VM, I feel like from a developer and a customer perspective, you might be like, okay, I'm done. I put it on the VM, and then you walk away. And in the short term, that might make sense, but then over the long term, there's not really any pull to say, wait a second, maybe we should like modernize, right, that app, even though it takes work. Whereas I have to admit, even running on with AKS, you know, you're like, okay, I'm using it as a micro VM, but I can do so much more. Maybe I should be, maybe there's that sort of vibe, like I should be looking at some of these apps running in this container, and I feel incentivized to do a little something, modernize, re-architect, factor them, crack them off, do something. So I feel like if you just land on a VM, you're like, okay, it'll still be running there for the next 20 years.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's non-technical reasons for them to move, right? Yeah, add-on, group policy, domain join, everything else.
Yeah.
Container and Kubernetes, same code base. No, you don't join those to the domain. Of course, no GPO. So in some ways, those are the big moves.
Yeah, and we definitely hear that, right? It's a little of the, and I came from an ops background at one point in time. I've been a developer as well, and I always get a little squeamish when I'm like, okay, well, there's a reason that someone said we want this under group policy, and are we walking away from that? But at the same time, I think we were talking about this earlier in terms of, you know, patching container hosts. We don't patch container hosts. We throw them away and replace them with new ones, right? And you know, it's a whole paradigm shift that got us to the same place the GPO did, or even better in arguable ways. And so, you know, as long as we've got good answers to why we're changing that, yeah, I think there's some reason for it. There's also the other part of the political spectrum of developers get excited about it because it's something that is going to enhance their career and their skill set. No one's, you know, waking up in the morning and saying like, okay, I'm going to go start deploying some stuff to VMs. That's going to take me to my next job and the next job and the next job. Learning skills around containers and Kubernetes, that will take them to the next job and the next job. And so they're building value in it. And this was one of the reasons that the M365 team decided to use Kubernetes, is that it's a heck of a lot easier to hire and retain talent when you're using something that has intrinsic value outside of the organization. People are excited about it. They get the benefit of being part of a community. They get to benefit from an ecosystem. They get to learn skills that are transferable to new areas later on.
Okay, cool. So we've got a handful of minutes left. Just want to be mindful of time. If folks have any last sort of questions, again, whether from the chat online or with everyone here in the room, just want to make sure we got time.
I've got one online.
Okay.
What are the benefits of Azure versus AWS for .NET apps?
You know, I'm going to say two words, app service. And I admit I'm completely biased. You shouldn't be surprised by that. But there's nothing in AWS that's right click, publish. I know, again, you're going to do the right thing when you actually run .NET apps at scale. But Yeah, when we developed it on day zero, we were aiming for a very simple experience for someone that can rock up to the service. You don't need to know everything there is to know about cloud and scaling and cloud native on day zero, and yet you can get up and running and be very successful in the cloud. And we did that all the way back on day zero, and I got to admit, here we are 10 years later, and we're still pushing the envelope on that. So,
couple others that I would highlight is the Azure hybrid use benefit. So most customers who are going to be making that journey have Windows Server licenses that they've paid for through annuity on-prem. Those are licenses are transferable into Azure, so you get a benefit around Azure hybrid use benefit. Ultimately, I believe very strongly that Windows is kind of our birthright and a thing that we've worked on for a long time, and so the end-to-end experiences around it and the services are going to continue to be more and more polished around it. AWS has done a fantastic job of supporting Windows customers, and I will give them a lot of credit for the work that they've done, but I do believe that ultimately Azure is going to have a stronger experience for our faithful Windows customers.
Yeah, to actually close out on that, we are built on internally on .NET, and even though we run a lot of Linux, a lot of Windows and Azure. So yeah.
No.
So the question is, app service going away anytime soon? Let me see. I'll just be going to Jamaica next. No, it's not. Jokingly, but also half seriously, it's now become, for all practical purposes, part of the let's say in quotes, the Azure fabric. Everyone and their mother internally runs workloads on us, even though we're not purely, how to put it, to start up a new region, just to like turn the engine on, you technically don't need app service. But once you get beyond that, it turns out you need us for like everything. So yeah, we're not going away anytime soon.
And you do now need AKS for every region.
Yeah.
That has now become a requirement for all new regions.
So that one I will happily leave to you, that burden to you and the AKS team, because we can wait just a handful of weeks before we need to come in, and then
it is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so look, I'm just going to flip back over to the slides real quick, and basically I just want to get to the final one, which is Mayank and folks who work with us put together a number of links just here for folks both here as well as online. Main thing is we've got some nice articles that go over like everything that's going on here at Build. Literally the first link there, aka.ms/modern-apps. It lists out everything that's there for Kubernetes, for functions, API management, app service that's going on at Build. It's a nice blog post write-up, which means you don't have to remember anything. You can come back a day, a week, a month, a year from now, and it's got a great set of links and write-ups for everything. So beyond that then, I think, thank you everyone for dropping by. Thank you for the folks who are online who've been asking the questions, and also for folks here who've been asking questions. Thanks for dropping by. Great to see everyone physically here for the first time ever.